Close your eyes and picture a Viking. Filthy, enormous, a horned helmet, a bloody axe, a mindless savage who lived only to burn, loot, and kill. Now let me tell you something that will bother you for the rest of this video. Almost none of that is true. The horned helmet never happened. The filth, the opposite of the truth. The mindless savage, a caricature written by the people they frightened, for over 1,000 years. We have remembered the Norse through the eyes of the monks they raided, and the opera composers who came centuries later. And that version is closer to propaganda than to history. The real Vikings were explorers who reached America 500 years before Columbus. They were traders whose silver roads ran all the way to Baghdad. They bathed weekly in an age when kings did not, held some of the earliest democratic assemblies in Europe, and gave their women rights that most of the medieval world denied. This is the complete story of who the Norse actually were, and how the losers of history, the ones with the pens, turned one of the most advanced cultures of their age into the monsters of our nightmares. By the end, you'll wonder who the real barbarians were. Let's start with the most famous Viking of all, the one with the horns on his helmet. Here is the problem. Not a single horned helmet has ever been found in a Viking grave. Not one. Archaeologists have unearthed hundreds of Norse helmets, and they are simple, rounded caps of iron built for battle. Horns on a helmet in real combat would be suicide, something to catch a blade or a rope and snap your neck. So where did the image come from? Not from the Vikings at all. It came from the 1800s, from Scandinavian romantic painters, and above all from a costume designer for a German opera, Wagner's Ring Cycle, in 1876. He put horns on the singers to make them look wild and pagan and ancient. The image was so striking that it stuck, and within a few decades the whole world believed the Vikings had worn them for 1,000 years. Think about that. The single most recognizable fact everyone knows about the Vikings was invented for a stage play, more than 8 centuries after the Viking Age ended. If the most basic detail is a costume, what else in the story have we gotten wrong? As it turns out, almost everything. Now the filth, we imagine the Vikings as greasy, stinking brutes. The reality is almost the exact reverse. Archaeologists keep digging up Viking combs, thousands of them carved from antler and bone in nearly every settlement and grave. Tweezers, ear cleaners, razors. The Norse groomed themselves obsessively. Written sources back it up. An English chronicler complained bitterly that the Danish men in his town were seducing English women, because he wrote, "They combed their hair every day, changed their clothes often, and bathed once a week." Once a week, to us that sounds like nothing. In the medieval world, that made them fastidiously, almost suspiciously clean. Most Europeans of the time bathed a few times a year, if that. The Norse even had a dedicated word and day for it, so the picture flips completely. The men we call dirty savages were, by the standards of their own age, the best groomed people in the room, cleaner than the very Englishmen and monks who would later write them down as animals. The insult wasn't hygiene, it was envy. We think of the Vikings as lawless. In truth, they built one of the most sophisticated legal cultures of the early medieval world. At the heart of Norse society was the Thing, an open-air assembly where free men gathered to make laws, settle disputes, and judge crimes. Not a king barking orders, a gathering of the community where cases were argued and decided in public. Iceland took this furthest of all, founding the All-Thing in the year 930, an assembly that is often called the oldest surviving parliament in the world, still meeting in name more than 1,000 years later. These people had property law, inheritance law, rules for trade, and elaborate systems of compensation to stop feuds from spiraling into endless blood. Yes, their world could be violent, but it was governed by rules, argued by ordinary free men. In an age when most of Europe simply obeyed whoever held the sword, the lawless barbarians had a functioning democracy centuries before the word became fashionable again. Once more, the label tells us more about the people who applied it than about the Norse themselves. Here is a truth that would have shocked most of medieval Europe. Norse women had rights that women elsewhere could only dream of. A free Norse woman could own property. She could request a divorce and keep her dowry when she did. She could run a farm or a business, inherit wealth, and represent herself in legal matters. The keys to the household hung at her belt as a symbol of real authority, while much of the Christian world treated women as the possession of a father or husband. Norse law gave them a voice, a purse, and a way out for bad marriage. And the archaeology keeps deepening the picture. One of the most famous warrior graves in Scandinavia, filled with weapons and horses and the full honors of a military leader, was long assumed to belong to a man, until DNA testing revealed the warrior was a woman. The sagas full of fierce, powerful women were not just fantasy. The society that we imagine as a brutal boys' club gave its women more freedom than almost anywhere else in the medieval West. That is not the story we were told. And now the fact that should be in every history book and somehow still isn't. Around the year 1000, nearly 5 centuries before Columbus set sail, Norse explorers reached North America. They had already leapt across the Atlantic in stages, settling Iceland, then Greenland, pushing the edge of the known world further with each generation. Then Leif Erikson and those who followed him made landfall on a coast they called Vinland, land of wine, almost certainly Newfoundland in modern Canada. This is not a legend argued over by enthusiasts. In the 1960s, archaeologists uncovered the unmistakable remains of a Norse settlement at Elance Orks Meadows, Viking-style buildings, iron nails, tools, the hard physical proof that Europeans stood on American soil around the year 1000. They didn't stay, the distances were vast, the local peoples resisted, and the tiny colonies faded. But the achievement stands. In open wooden boats without compasses, the Norse crossed the deadliest ocean on Earth and touched a continent Europe wouldn't discover for another 500 years. Not bad for people we call primitive savages. The Vikings we picture only raiding were, just as often, traders, and their trade network was staggering. From their homelands they pushed east, down the great rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine, in boats they could carry between waterways on their shoulders. They founded trading towns, and the Norse who went east became known as the Rus, the very name that would one day become Russia. Their goal was silver. They carried furs, amber, honey, and enslaved captives south to the markets of Constantinople and the vast, wealthy Islamic Caliphate. Archaeologists find hundreds of thousands of Arabic silver coins buried across Scandinavia, coins minted in Baghdad and Samarkand, carried thousands of miles north by Norse merchants. Some Vikings served as elite bodyguards to the emperor in Constantinople, the famous Varangian Guard. This was not the reach of mindless brutes. It was a trading empire that stretched from the coast of North America in the west to the markets of the Middle East in the east, one of the widest networks any European people had ever built. They were, above all, connectors of a world that thought itself far larger than it was. None of this means the Vikings were gentle. The raids were real and they were terrifying. But even here, the mindless savage story falls apart the moment you ask a simple question. Why did it start? For centuries, the Norse had traded peacefully with their neighbors. Then, at the end of the 700s, the raids began, and there were reasons. Growing populations and scarce farmland at home pushed young men to seek fortune abroad. Political pressure from expanding Christian kingdoms to the south squeezed them, and they had noticed something irresistible. The monasteries of Britain and Europe were stuffed with gold, silver, and food, and defended by no one. To a seafaring people with the fastest ships in the world, an undefended treasure house on the coast wasn't a temptation. It was an opportunity. The first great raid, on the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793. Horrified Christian Europe precisely because holy men had never imagined anyone would dare. The Vikings dared. It was brutal, but it was strategy, not bloodlust. They struck the softest, richest targets, exactly as any rational raider would. So why do we remember only the axe and the fire? Because of who wrote the history. The Vikings left very few written records of their own. Their sagas were composed centuries later. The people who did write at the time were the literate monks of Christian Europe, the exact men whose monasteries were being raided. Imagine describing an enemy who has just burned your church, killed your brothers, and stolen everything holy to you. You would not write a balanced account. You would write that they were devils, sent by God to punish a sinful world, and that is very nearly word for word what the monks wrote. For 1,000 years we took the propaganda of the victims as the objective truth. Meanwhile, the raids themselves, though savage, were no worse than the wars the Christian kings waged constantly on one another. The same burning, the same slaughter, the same slaving. The difference is that the Vikings were pagans and outsiders. And the losers with the pens got to decide who counted as a monster. History is not what happened. History is what the people who could write chose to remember. Some of the legend, of course, was real. The Norse were formidable warriors, and among them were the Berserkers, fighters who worked themselves into a trance of fury before battle, said to feel no pain and no fear, possibly aided by ritual, exhaustion, or something they drank. From them we get the very word berserk. Their culture prized courage, loyalty, and a good death, and they told stories of gods and monsters and the end of the world that still grip us today. But there is a difference between a proud warrior culture and a horde of mindless animals, and the Vikings were firmly the former. They were farmers who fought, merchants who explored, poets who carved runes, and craftsmen who built ships so perfect that modern replicas have crossed oceans. The Berserker was one thread in a rich and complicated society, not the whole cloth. We took the most frightening fragment of who they were and pretended it was all of them. Real people are never as simple as the monsters we make of them. So let's go back to the Viking you pictured at the start, the filthy, horned, mindless savage. Now look at what we actually found. The horns were invented for an opera. The filth was cleanliness that made their neighbors jealous. The lawlessness was one of Europe's earliest democracies. The oppressed nobody women could own property and divorce. The primitives crossed the Atlantic and reached America, and traded silver from Baghdad to Newfoundland. And the mindless bloodlust was a calculated strategy, no crueler than the Christian kings who wrote the Norse down as demons. The Vikings were not saints. They raided, they enslaved, they killed. But so did everyone in their brutal age, and only the Vikings got remembered as the monsters because they lost the war for the written word. This is the pattern of history itself. The people with the pens decide who the villains are. So the next time a story hands you a simple monster, ask the older question: who was really so different from everyone else, and who simply lost the right to tell their own story? The real barbarians, very often, were the ones holding the quill.